Great. Hello and welcome to the Yet Another Value podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Walker. And with me today, I'm excited to have two people from Cove Street Capital. Ben Claremon, who is a partner and portfolio manager, and Eugene Robin, who is a principal and research analyst at Claremon. Guys, how's it go? At Cove Street, I'm sorry. Guys, how's it going?
Good. Doing well. Thanks for having us on.
Great. Well, hey, let me start this podcast the way I do every podcast, and that's by pitching, I guess, the two of you for this one. But I actually first heard of Cove Street 3 or 4 years ago when you guys published a very detailed short rebuttal report on the stock that we're going to talk about today, Viasat. And it just stuck in my head because I remember reading it and thinking to myself, this is a really, really good piece of research. And especially 3 or 4 years ago, it was still on the heels of all the reverse China merger frauds. I mean, a lot of people did not want to speak up against activist shorts for fear of being embarrassed. And I thought you guys published a really detailed response. And I thought it spoke to how convicted you were that you were willing to go out and say, hey, no, like the Carousel published a short report, and you guys said, hey, no, this is wrong. And, I thought it spoke to conviction, how much work and how much confidence you guys had in it. So that always really stuck with me. I've talked to both of you one-off about other ideas, and I can say that you guys have done an extreme amount of due diligence, research, thought on all of the ideas we've discussed. So I'm just really excited to have you guys on the podcast and to talk about Viasat.
Yeah, well, thanks for having us. I mean, I think Eugene did all the work there. But it goes to our philosophy to some degree that, listen, we don't have a monopoly on good ideas, and we are always looking for disconfirming information. So if someone's willing to engage with us in a productive discussion about one of our securities, we love that, right? We want to hear the short points. We want to hear what people are concerned about. We want to have a chance to respond. So, for us, we try not to get married to our ideas. Yep. and our convictions and our theses. We want to have a malleable mindset, and we want to be able to take people's input and really investigate short points that people put out. So, I think that is just, it's emblematic of the amount of work we've done in general, but especially when it comes to Viasat.
I'm with you. A lot of times if I'm 1 to 10, if I'm an 8 or a 9 on a company, I'm not going to get the most from talking to someone who's an 8 or a 9. And I probably won't get a lot talking to someone who's a 1 because they might be so biased that it's almost not worth. But if somebody's a 2 or a 3 on a company or a 4, that's often the best conversation because you have different lenses and different angles. And that's where you can really explore and learn a lot about the company and push back on the thesis. So yeah, I guess, Ben, I think you can start. Why don't we just discuss, Viasat? What is it? Broad overview. Why are you guys so attracted to it?
Yeah, so happy to do that. And the reason, we at Cove Street, we team tackle ideas. And so, and we work on ideas jointly. While it's Viasat is one of our largest positions in our small cap strategy, and it's the second largest position in the strategy that I co-manage. Eugene's the lead, and he really has the longest history here, and I'll briefly describe that. Eugene worked for the company, his father worked for the company, and so that gives us a lens that it's really hard, I think, to replicate. And I'm just going to say it outright. We have no inside information here. No one's worked there for years. Like everything happens at arm's length with the company. But to understand the culture and the people, which is a big part of our process, having that background, I think, is really important. And the other thing is just having a nuanced understanding of the business. I've just, having owned this company for, I think Eugene said, since 2014. It's just amazing to understand, like, the degree to which you can build a nuanced understanding of that business and the people if you had an inside point of view. And so that I think, if you're wondering, we're always looking for what distinguishes us or what distinguishes our position in a company. I think that longevity is helpful. So I'm just going to go really high level and talk about Viasat, because it may seem like a difficult company to understand, but it's really not. They basically are supplying high throughput satellite connectivity to any number of end uses. So if you think about the world where every day there is more and more demand for connectivity. There's more and more demand for bandwidth. And what is 5G? 5G from the wireless companies is a play on that. What is the love that you see in the US cable market, the broadband market, right? The fixed cable market, that comes, it comes from the demand for bandwidth. And so Viasat is just another provider, and they'll be global, but right now it's mostly in North America and a little bit of South America, providing bandwidth to anyone from rural consumers to in-flight Wi-Fi. We'll talk about the military, which is a big opportunity, and they also supply equipment into that space. And Eugene, I think hopefully we'll get into their military business, which is a little different. They are supplying equipment and eventually connectivity, but there's other things that we like about that. So what's really funny about this stock is it really just brings out animal spirits and big opinions about the ability for it to be successful. One of the reasons is because so many satellite companies have gone bankrupt. I mean, especially people who operate in the LEO space, which is low Earth orbit, and we'll get into that. I hope what all that is, but it's just that, and the fact that SpaceX and through their Starlink sub is a competitor here. It's amazing to the degree that Viasat gets all kinds. There's just people have very, very divergent opinions here, and in our experience, when people have that level of divergent opinions, there can be really interesting opportunities. So I have Eugene and I have done a podcast and an interview on this and a presentation on this before, and some of our slides, which we're happy to send over and put in the show notes, maybe, talk about myths and misperceptions. And I think those are some things that we'd like to address here, because I think there's a lot of misperceptions about this company, which is where, where we think the value is. But I also, at some point want to talk about just pulling back from all of that hyperbole you read about and all the love for Elon Musk and all the worry about competition. I think it's really valuable to dig into the weeds, but it's also really valuable to step back and look at the industry overall, and look at the tailwinds it has, and the growing TAM, and any number of new uses that'll be enabled, as connectivity starts to kind of be rolled out as Viasat launches satellites. So that's the really high level of our ownership, our history. Oh, by the way, Jeff, our founder, has owned this company on and off for a couple decades, actually. And we have letters going back from the 1990s where Jeff was harassing management. So, this is a business that we've known for a long time, and we've, it has changed over time as well. And having Eugene on the team with his experience at the company, has just been invaluable for us to kind of pivot and understand the company as it's grown and changed.
So Eugene, when I look at Viasat, I think the first thing when anyone mentions Viasat, battleground stock, right? Carousel published a short report. You guys published a rebuttal. I think, Eugene, you were the one who published the rebuttal, if I'm remembering the report correctly. Short interest, 13% of the float. Analyst price targets, I don't really look at sell side that much, but I just pulled up Bloomberg analyst price targets from 42 per share to 145 per share. I mean, huge range. When you look at all these different perspectives and everything, what do you think is the biggest thing that people miss, or the biggest misperception about Viasat? Maybe it's among the bears, or maybe it's just among the people who are blah, but what do you think the biggest misperception is?
I think the biggest misperception is that this is a play on residential broadband. And that misperception actually goes back to Carousel's piece. And Sam wrote a great piece, and he had certain really great points. And fast forward 6 years, and those points are still very relevant. So, and I've always said this to people: I'm not arguing that this should never be shorted, or all the short points are incorrect. I'm arguing that they're just focusing on the wrong things. The fact is that residential broadband was the initial impetus for them to get into the satellite services space in the first place when they bought Wild Blue, which is true. But over the past 6 years, it's actually morphed into a multi-legged stool. So they have residential broadband, they have in-flight Wi-Fi. They're going to have maritime services and offshore with the RigNet acquisition that they did. They have community Wi-Fi, which is effectively what everyone from Facebook to, well, Elon back in the day before he started charging $100 a month, used to say like, oh, this is going to bring connectivity to poor people around the world. And that's not happening with Starlink. It's actually happening with Viasat right now. They have business jet services. They have, kind of various, I don't know, I guess co-ventures with governments from Brazil to Mexico to in some of the European countries that they have through the Eutelsat former JV. So they have a lot of different kind of irons in the fire, right? They don't just rely on residential broadband to sort of make the returns on their capital investments work. The other thing, and I think the real biggest miss that everyone just completely whiffs on, the crown jewel here, it's actually the government system side. So I mean, when I worked at Viasat, that's what Viasat was. It was a government contractor, and they had, they were the upstart actually in the encryption networking piece of a lot of how the DoD does real-time battlefield communications. And so, I worked within that network systems group, and I saw from the inside out, what Viasat's really, really good at versus the competitors. And I will tell you that this was the case back then, and it's more so the case now. Most of the larger contractors, L3 or Northrop or Lockheed, would love to get their hands on Viasat's government business. I think the private market value, we've put out pieces, ad nauseum about this, but on some of the parts, that value itself is, you can argue that it's, I'm not talking about the, X the debt, right? It's probably somewhere where the stock is right now, right? And that's always given us comfort that while the shorts may be correct in some of their points, they're not actually correct about the value and the inherent value within the system. So I think that's the biggest misperception, is that this is just a residential play, and that, oh my God, Starlink is going to come in and eat everyone's lunch, and there's going to be a singular winner, and it's going to be Elon with the pizza on a stick, and that's going to be the end of Viasat and Hughes and Intelsat and Inmarsat and Eutelsat and SES and everyone else. Our argument's really more about, I think what he's doing at Starlink is incredible, and I think he's going to be successful, but he's going to expand the pie for everyone, and there will be losers. And what people forget is that the Viasat Geo system actually was the disruptor within Geo, as opposed to saying like, oh, they're this, they're the sleepy government contractor and a person who's rolled the coattails of, terrible connectivity for years and years and years. And you could kind of point your finger at Hughes or SES or Intelsat or Inmarsat for that title. I mean, the incumbents really were those folks. Viasat just basically changed the game, and the concept of a high throughput satellite didn't exist until Viasat 1 was launched. Most people said like, oh, that's nonsense. Dankberg is out of his mind. There's no way that he's going to get those bit economics for Viasat 1. You got him. Viasat 2, that's nonsense. It's never going to happen. They're never going to get those sorts of connectivity down to the seat on a plane. They got them. And now, they have the third generation, which if you extrapolate it out after the full system is launched across the world, 3 terabits, it's going to be more than every single competitor in Geo put together, multiplied by, I think, a factor of roughly 8. So, I always talk about one of the things that, who's going to win, right? And I think Mark does a great job when he talks about the industry. There's going to be a pie, and your share of the pie is going to be your bandwidth capacity in space. So if I have 3.5 terabits and the overall bandwidth capacity is 15 terabits, and people are sucking up bandwidth as much as they can, which I agree with Elon and everyone who's going into kind of space connectivity. You're looking at a 20-ish% market share, and I think that's the overall point. If you aggregate all the existing satellite systems, it's probably around 10 billion. Depends on how you define it. 10 billion of revenue right now today. So people are valuing Viasat as if it's going to get 0 to 2 or 4% of it, and I think that's just a misperception of the value that they're going to put forth, and that's what we're kind of betting on, with the fact that the military side gives us a base level of comfort from which to start from. I'm happy to go through. I know that was kind of a long-winded response to your question.
No, that was perfect. Let me just jump right into some pushbacks, right? I think the first pushback anybody who's an investor is going to have is they're going to say, hey, Eugene is the lead on this, right? And he used to work at Viasat, which gives him great insight. But it does, first thing that jumps out to me is he worked on the government side, and then he's going to say, hey, the government side is the crown jewel. He worked there. I think the obvious first pushback is, Eugene, are you too connected to this? So how do you separate out kind of your past from an objective look at this company?
That's a great question. Well, I have everyone else at Viasat or at Cove Street that kind of pushes me to not prove, but at least defend the long points that we have, and it's a constant thing, right? I mean, there's news flow happening daily on Leos and things like that. So, I certainly get internal pushback, but for my own sort of sanity, I'm not going to tell you that I haven't changed my assumptions or expectations as time has progressed, and I have. I think one of the biggest ones is I did used to believe that they could have a bigger and bigger install base for residential, and that has changed, right? Because I'm not going to sit here with my head in the sand and saying Starlink isn't going to work. I mean, not only is it going to work, it's working, right? So you can't say oh, well, that's not going to happen. Okay, so that is something that's different from, I think, when Sam at Kerrisdale wrote his short, as there's an actual, his short was based on 4G, which was, I don't think he quite understood the nuances of where towers are built and things like that. But I think fast forward, there is a real competitor that I believe will capture a very large share of traditional rural residential broadband. So that assumption changed over time. At the same time, I didn't think that they'd be as successful as they are in flight Wi-Fi, and in 20 obviously being a very bizarre year, everyone kind of took a break from expanding the in-flight Wi-Fi capabilities of the fleets, but that's just a breather, right? In longer term, it's hard to argue that when you go on a plane, whether it's international or domestic, and I'm saying around the world, not just in the US, I'm saying Europe, Asia Pacific, Middle East, Africa, wherever you are, I think you're going to go on with the expectation and with the realization that you can, in fact, have some version of high-speed connectivity at your seat, right? So I think that has actually progressed faster than I thought. So that was like a bump up in my model. Going through to their international kind of footholds in Brazil and the things that they're doing in Europe. I check in on people, resellers and whatnot once in a while to see how things are going. And I will tell you, again, the maxim of if you build it, they will come, it fits here. It's all about bandwidth availability. It's not that there's no desire for bandwidth, it's just there is no bandwidth, right? Historically, satellite has been so terrible that people have said, oh, it's a horrific service, and I'd never use it. But if you actually provide someone with a good service, it's been shown in the wild that people will buy it. So anyway, I constantly pick at my assumptions of value, right? And what are the drivers for it? Like I said, residential broadband, in-flight connectivity, some community Wi-Fi, what they consider to be other kind of avenues for growth, whether it's their Mexican ventures or some of the school stuff that they're doing in Brazil. And then obviously the military being one of the biggest ones that I think that people kind of, again, I don't think they quite understand what's happening there. But anyway, so I do push back at like, what is the earnings power when this entire system is up and running? And this is such a difficult company really to defend because it's a show me stock, right? Like I can tell you everything I just said, but in reality, until they have a worldwide capable kind of network of satellites up that pumps out over 3 terabits per second of available capacity, it's speculative in that sense. And I think that's truly why people hate this thing. It's not that it's they haven't done a good job. I mean, look at their results. I think starting from a base level of 0 and learning how to sell residential and learning how to be in in-flight Wi-Fi and things like that, they've done a fantastic job. They destroyed GoGo. They destroyed Global Eagle, right? When they pointed their connectivity at that market, they won not only a fair share but a great part of the rural broadband kind of pie, and they took it from Hughes and have kept it, right? So it's not like they've been doing this in in a vacuum of no competition. So anyway, my biggest thing is that I know the drivers of value, and I know what it'll take to make each satellite economic and hit their internal rates of return. And I constantly measure whether or not I can see them marching towards that goal. And the day that I can someone can show me that what you thought that this constellation would provide X dollars of profitability, and it's not revenue, it's profitability for me, and it's only like X times 0.65. If someone can show me that, then I will say, I'm wrong and I'm selling the stock tomorrow, because their model isn't working, and they're, it's just, they're maybe going to get their capex back in terms of returns, but they're certainly not going to make a positive return on invested capital. But I the way that I track it internally, I still see them earning very high returns on their invested dollar. So I guess that's it.
And look, I wasn't trying to accuse you of that. I was just saying that that's the obvious first red flag for anyone. Yeah. Ben, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I mean, we have a process that involves 2 longs and 1 short for every idea. And the short analyst on Viasat has probably jumped around multiple times over the years so that everyone could get their shots at Eugene. And we have a very iterative process by which every day we're sending emails to Eugene being like, what is this? What does this mean? Is this good? Is this bad? What about regulation? I mean, there's just this stock just comes with a lot of baggage, is probably the right word, because you've got all these competitive set, you've got the hype of Elon Musk, you've got all this, like, what in the world are the regulators going to do if we're launching tens of thousands of satellites into the sky? Is that ever going to slow down? Like, are the regulators ever going to look at whether that makes sense? Like, there's so many things that go along with this, that there, as Eugene said, there's constant news flow. And so we have to keep him fresh, we have to keep the idea fresh, we have to continually update our understanding of the competitive set, the TAM, and then emerging opportunities. And so for sure, the investment thesis has changed to some degree as the military business has gotten bigger, as in-flight Wi-Fi has actually become a very large opportunity for them. So I think we've evolved with the idea, and not a week goes by where we are not poking at Eugene's theses. And to some extent, what can he say other than, let's see what Viasat 3 looks like? Right? We've got 3 satellites that are going to go up over the next 2.5 years. They're going to have global coverage of, for in-flight Wi-Fi. They're going to have incredible assets as a result of having a satellite over Asia and kind of the Middle East. Right? There's all kinds of defense applications for that, which, it's a show me stock. Until it's up, the military is not going to buy connectivity. But I think, and I hope we'll get into this a little bit, Viasat's planted a number of Trojan horses within the military that are going to lead to connectivity relationships. They have a lot of equipment on the ground already, whether it's the Link 16 business, or there's just all the base stations and ground stations that they've been installing and they will be installing, right? These are the things that you have to be able to look around the corner to be able to understand, just to size and to actually know that they're going to be there. And that's where the nuanced understanding of the business comes from.
So let me just stick with broad concerns here. So, I think Viasat 3, 8 or 10x's their capacity. I can't remember the exact, but it's a lot of extra capacity. And, I invest in telecom. One of my largest positions is cable. And when I hear, hey, we're doing a ginormous increase in capacity and all this capacity is going up across the industry, like that actually causes me concern, right? Because I have visions of Verizon Fios coming in and overbuilding, and Google Fiber, or people who have a little bit more gray hair than both of us might think back to kind of the 2000 timeframe, where all these telecoms are just laying down huge amounts of capacity, and then all the capacity lights up, and the demand isn't quite there, and there's prices are just dropping. So, when you look at Viasat, you see, hey, Viasat 3 is coming on. That's going to be a huge increase in capacity at the same time that Starlink, SpaceX, as you guys mentioned, is dropping huge increases in capacity with LEO. It's a little bit of a different business, but I see lots of capacity coming online across the board, and that to me says, ooh, there could be the potential for price increases. And I think I kind of overlay that thought with and Eugene, you mentioned it. The history of satellite providers is there's a lot of bankruptcies. Gogo, Intelsat, just most satellite companies end up in bankruptcy at some point. So I see both of those two kind of coalescing into one giant overarching sector risk, if that makes sense. So I don't know which one of you wants to respond or how you want to respond, but I think that's probably another big sticking point.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think that the way that I've always looked at it, and what you said is 100% correct. And I think even when I responded to Carousdale back in the day, I said, 1 + 1 does not equal 2 in the satellite industry. 1 + 1 is like 1, I said 1.8, but it's probably even less than that. And what I meant by that, and it still is the case, when you increase your capacity by 8x, that doesn't mean that you have 8 times as many customers. In fact, you might only have 20% more customers. But what happens is you price on a per bit delivered basis much lower, right? And in the end, people just have to think about connectivity, and even the way that you get connectivity at your house. I mean, connectivity is a commodity, right? I mean, what do you care about? You care about, I want to have the fastest speed I can get with the highest, available actual capacity for the lowest dollar cost. And the government is no different. I mean, they have certain requirements in terms of encryption and things that are more hardware dependent, but then they care about that too, right? And so my answer to anyone who's like, oh, well, what are this capacity? I'm like, totally. But let's say that again, think of it as the pie example, right? If the pie of capacity is, I'm just making a number up, 10 terabits, right? And you, Viasat, control 3.5 of those. On all else being equal, right? If you're just pricing per bit at the exact same price as your competitors, right? So you're undifferentiated because you're a commodity. You should get roughly 35% of the pie, right? I mean, it's not rocket science. Now here's the nuance that comes in. On a per bit basis, the 3rd generation of Viasat satellites are going to come in at something around 90 cents, roughly. Hughes in Jupiter 2 is at 250. The Eutelsat system is at $7. The Inmarsat GX, which was once upon a time a great network, is at 56. I should just say that's probably the generation before the current one, but even the current generation it's not that great. So my overall point is that if I control the lowest priced commodity on an actual marginal cost basis, I'm going to win versus my competitors. And in the end, the competitors in Europe and the Middle East and Asia haven't seen Viasat. The ones in the United States have. And what happened is, Gogo went away, Global Eagle more or less went away. Hughes had to scramble and spend a lot of money, and it wasn't them, but L'Oreal stole the designs for Viasat 1 from Viasat in order to actually the Jupiter system is Viasat, which is funny. No one talks about that, but the core building blocks of it came from technology that Hughes bought from L'Oreal, which then L'Oreal stole. So in essence, like our premise is that once the Viasat system is activated over Europe, and if the key for them is if they have a good enough distribution strategy on the ground in Europe, they will win a piece of the pie. I don't know how big. Again, we can all make conjecture and projections and things like that, but it will be greater than zero, and that will be additive, right?
Let me ask you a stupid question from someone who is not a satellite expert, right? You mentioned Viasat 3, the cost per bit will be 90 cents versus everyone else's multiples higher, right? When I think of satellite or any type of data, right, I think the marginal cost of getting that bit is extremely low. So when you say the cost of a bit on Viasat is 90 cents versus a competitor at $2 or $3, is that the marginal cost per bit, or is that the all-in cost? Like, how are you thinking about that? Because I would almost think for all these guys, the marginal cost is going to be zero, but it sounds like I might be a little off on this.
No, 100%. You're correct. When I say like marginal cost in this, I guess it's the improper term, because you're correct in economic terms. Everyone's marginal cost is zero because they have all the sunk costs that they've already put into the capital expenditures. And the same thing for Viasat. I look at people on a baseline all-in basis, which
Gotcha.
I've done the analysis for the LEO side too. And the thing that I think that Starlink and Musk have that other LEOs never had is they have Musk, and he is a money-raising machine. And this is why I really do think it's going to be like Iridium, right? There was once a LEO player that survived the late 90s, early 2000s, and Starlink will survive and thrive because they have a very large pool of capital that doesn't really seemingly care about economics, and so they will provide that capital to build out the system. And again, one of the things that I was wrong about, and you can ask Ben, and we had many discussions, this is like 3 or 4 years ago, about like whether or not the system would be built. And I was like, this is crazy. Who would fund this? This is going to take $9.5 billion. They're getting funded. So I was clearly wrong, right? So
there are a lot of Tesla shorts who made this same mistake, and it was a lot more costly for them.
No, totally. And you know what? And goes back to like, I adjusted my expectations for residential broadband accordingly, because I was like, I couldn't believe my eyes, but sure enough, it was getting built. And, he's going to provide a very interesting service, not to as many people as people think, but he's going to be a very interesting service.
And not to talk too much SpaceX, but as a cable investor, SpaceX won, what is it, the RDOF or whatever, the rural build out. I think they're getting 800 million from the government or something. And I know a lot of cable investors were like, oh my God. And especially generalists were like, Elon Musk coming for the cable companies, bro, what you going to do? But I just don't think that, for rural, I think it makes sense. But right now, SpaceX, the rural internet, it's like $500 for the equipment plus $80 per month. I'm sure that'll come down over time. But like, unless you're real rural, it just doesn't make any economic sense.
So again, I still don't quite know how much of the demand for Starlink are just fanboys from the urban areas. I know obviously if you're in the middle of North Dakota, I track the speed tests and whatnot people post on Reddit. And so certainly, like those folks that's fantastic. What a great service. And he's going to make their lives a lot better by providing that service. So I know there's like a need for it. To say that they're going to compete against cable, it's a joke. I mean, I always try to explain this. The satellites aren't infinite, right? I mean, there's actual like physical, like as in physics, that are involved with the available capacity, right? And when you have your satellite system up on the ground, technically speaking, I can hit terabit speeds, right? If I have the available capacity, if there's one person on my network, right?
Yeah.
So like people are saying, well, how fast can it be? He can make it as fast as he wants it, right? I mean, he's like, the speeds are gonna double next year. He could do that, How? Well, you just reduce the available number of users, and the ones that are on your platform have really high speeds. I mean, it is rocket science.
This is one thing Viasat's been saying, right? With Viasat 2, they've been saying, hey, we're having to make this trade-off. Do we
Yes.
want more customers who we give less speed, or do we want less customers who we kind of live up to their speed expectations and we
Right.
wait to get Viasat 3 up there and can kind of provide them the speed they want to need?
In satellite talk, it's link budgeting. So link budgeting is the key to life. I mean, that's how you can go from, having 1,000 users with great service to 10,000 users, and 9,500 of them writing customer service reports saying like, you guys are terrible. It is what it is, right? This is the problem. Has always been the problem with satellite, and goes back to the point of, you rightfully mentioned that there's this massive explosion of capacity, and honestly, most of the people that have had satellite service, look at the consumer reports, right, hate it because there's not enough capacity. So while, as I said, it's not going to be additive in the sense of you're gonna generate more users, but the users that you will have, you will give them a better service, right? So part of the capex is basically a giveaway to your existing customers, and the growth part of that, though, is it will allow you to allocate to link budget things more and more to in-flight Wi-Fi, to the military, to community Wi-Fi applications, to maritime areas that haven't actually been touched by anyone. And I think, honestly, this is why Elon is doing what he's doing, because I think he sees this massive pie, and I think he believes, honestly and truth and rightfully so, that if you build it, they will come, because no one has provided that great of a service before, and he's right about that. So anyway,
let me switch tracks. So one of the things I like the most about your short rebuttal report, all these reports, is the argument, hey, if you look at this on a sum of the parts basis, there's this hidden gem in the government business, right? Which you mentioned earlier. I think the rough math is, hey, most other government contractors with size and scale and margins this good trade for 15 times EBITDA or something. And if you do the math on that, that's worth, closing in on the current stock price of Viasat. Obviously, you've got to take some debt out and everything. But I guess there are a couple questions on it. The first was, I remember in the short roller report, you specifically said, hey, if you gave us a week, we could call and have 8 bidders for this in the next week very easily. My first question would be, how the government contracting, I mean, it all operates off the satellite, right? So how can you hive this off as a different piece than the satellite business? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. So in essence, you'd be transfer pricing, and it basically be a fair price compensation for whatever the defense side buys. And right now, the defense side, people can break it apart, right? They break it between product and service. So part of the service revenue runs through Viasat's existing network, but the biggest chunk of it actually comes from reselling other connectivity providers, because obviously Viasat doesn't have connectivity over the Middle East, which is large demand for government services, and doesn't have connectivity over APAC. So I believe that the margin profile would still be the same. So people have said to me like, well, if you hive off this part, then you're going to have to pay market rates, ergo the margins for government systems are going to decline. And I'm like, yeah, true, that would be the case if 100% of the services was running through the Viasat network, but that's not the case. They're actually reselling other people's connectivity right now, which, by the way, let's forget about some of the parts. And if you think about what happens when they have a global network and they don't have to pay people for buying their bandwidth.
Yep.
That's you magically create value just by flipping on the switch and redirecting the bits on your own system.
All of a sudden, all that cost drops to zero, because
exactly.
As we talked about, the marginal cost once they get Viasat 3 up, it's zero. So all these costs for reselling the Middle East and Asia goes.
Anyway, so going back to your question about the defense side, I think it is separable. If you speak to the company, and it is the case that a lot of the R&D that's initiated at the defense level helps the commercial networks side.
Yep.
And so, it's a fair point. Like it's been put together in the way that it's been put together for a reason. But that's not to say that you couldn't separate. I mean, you really could. And by the way, they're two different cultures. And I was there probably, I don't know, a year and a half ago at last, and just walking around the campus, seeing the commercial connectivity side versus the people that I used to work with, and just what you would imagine to be a more software, like millennial culture on the connectivity side versus like the old stodgy, like, I was a Marine, and I sell like hardened communication equipment to guys who are in SOCOM, who are on the ground, like killing people in Syria. Completely different, right, in terms of the way they are. So
it doesn't seem like, obviously you've got some of the parts as kind of your fundamental backdrop of the thesis, but it doesn't sound like you think government's getting hived off and sold away from satellite and the core Viasat business at any time. Has there ever been a satellite business that has sold just their government services businesses and kind of retained the rest of the business?
That's a great question. I don't think so, because also, like the traditional satellite vendors like SES and Intelsat and Inmarsat, they always just had a connectivity line, right? I mean, they're going to between like government services and commercial, maritime, but in the end, it's all the same to them. For Viasat, their government systems is very specifically unique in the sense that the Link 16 family of products, from MIDS J to BATS D to the KG family of encryptors. I mean, those are products, right? So they have, technically speaking, nothing to do at all with the satellite. Now, as Ben mentioned, those are the Trojan horses, because the warfighters are out there, risking their lives and using unified communication systems. Those systems are powered by Viasat's hardware and encryption algorithms. So you can see that, like, if I'm going to bid for an RFP, I'm not saying that that's how the government is doing this, but if they were saying like, hey, we'll bundle our, the BATS D handhelds that are given to the individual warfighters with a promise of connectivity at X, right? It's a better value proposition for the U.S. military than going through separate vendors and picking and choosing this and that. So anyway, I think that Ben referenced it before. I think that gives them a little bit of a better edge. And if people want to kind of say like, oh, maybe this guy's full of crap, and check on stuff themselves, the Viasat just literally won a contract to design the military's next generation satellite connectivity, not system, but approach. So they're basically acting as a consultant to the to the Air Force specifically, to say like, hey, there's LEO, there's GEO. What should you guys do to that better or best optimizes what you actually need in terms of the connectivity for the various programs that you have. And so, like, they're giving this ability to design, to have input to someone who's a vendor on the geo side. I mean, that I think should tell people everything they need to know about what the parts of the DoD think about the people at Viasat and their importance to secure and encrypted communications for people who are actually on the ground doing the fighting. Anyway,
that's great. Ben, let me zoom out for a second, because I think we got into the weeds, and I think we did a really nice job of explaining how this government specific piece actually is really good. But let me zoom out for a second and hit you with what I'm going to call the stock price bear case, right? The short report came out 2016, 2017. You guys published a rebuttal. At the time, the stock's in the 60s or 70s. Here we are today. It's in the 50s. Last July, multi-year lows. The company does an equity issuance at $40 per share. They do another, I think they issue 5% of the company to buy RigNet, in what I think is an interesting acquisition. But if I'm just looking at it, I'm saying, hey, you guys have been wrong. The stock's down. This is a satellite company. Yes, it's CapEx intensive, but it's not exactly like that CapEx is a secret. And they just had to dilute shareholders pretty massively at multi-year lows at the height of the pandemic in July. When I look at all that, I say, hey, this company doesn't treat their equity very dearly. Stock price has gone the wrong way. it's been wrong. Like, why am I not looking at a company that I think another bear piece is they've never really generated true free cash flow. I know you guys have pushed back on that, but if I roll out all that up, it does paint a little bit of something weird is going on here, and the company might think their shares are better served issuing shares than kind of keeping the share count down. So how would you respond to that as a portfolio manager?
Yeah, I mean, listen, anything that you can come up with, we have relayed to them regarding our concerns about, timing of equity issuance, why use equity for RigNet. I mean, these are things that we talk about, but let's talk a little bit about the unique circumstances that 2020 put them in.
Absolutely,
right?
absolutely.
So first of all, you have the IFC, their in-flight Wi-Fi business, which was about to really start to hit a trajectory you can see that recent news that they've just won 300 new planes from Delta, that'll be switched over from one of their competitors. I think they had an enormous amount of momentum to start really building that business. And then of course, COVID hit and people stopped flying. So not only are you not winning new business because the airlines are freaking out and not spending a lot of time, spending money, outfitting planes to work with Viasat versus some of the competitors. You also have, just the variable nature of that business, the variable revenue based on how many people are flying, take rates and stuff like that for Wi-Fi, those are way down. And in the middle of that, you're spending for a 3 satellite constellation that you just can't stop spending for, right? Like, this is, to some extent, no pun intended here, but there's a space race here, right? And they really need to be able to, hit the timelines in order to work with Boeing to get these satellites launched. So, I think they found themselves last year staring down a situation where there was a potential liquidity problem. And so the question is, do you want a slightly smaller pie for everyone, or do you want to risk something really catastrophic where the pot that you have permanent capital impairment from some kind of dilutive financing you have to do? Look, I mean, in hindsight, anybody who raised $1 of equity and didn't just lever their balance sheets more in 2020 looks foolish, right? But I will say, and I say this all the time when people are asked about what did you guys miss in 2020? What were you wrong about? Yeah, in hindsight, we were wrong about a lot of things. We should have just levered up and bought everything because everything went up. But my point is that there were other paths, right? There were other outcomes whereby maybe things don't get better as quickly as they have. So I think these are very fair points, and these are things that we debate internally a lot. I think, having Baupost there as a board observer and having the Baupost be the largest shareholder, they participated in the offering. I think that gives us a little bit of comfort, but there was a confluence of factors that were sort of unlucky. They kind of hit a perfect storm. The RigNet deal, I'll let Eugene, weigh in a little bit, but if you read through the deal proxy, they've been working on this, it was like since 2016, Eugene, or something like that. Like, they've been looking at this deal for 5 years. It makes an enormous amount of sense. We don't want to say too much. It's not that we know something that no one else knows. Just open up the RigNet 10K and look how much they spend on, getting connectivity from other people, and just kind of getting to your point, Andrew, about, what happens when you have your own capacity. All that reselling and buying capacity from others goes away. We think that, this is a very, very good deal. As they need a shareholder vote, they're being slightly coy about talking about all the synergies that are going to come from it, because they need the RigNet shareholders to approve it. But the only way this was going to get done was through equity. And so again, if this is an enormously logical deal from a sales channel perspective, from a new total addressable markets where kind of in the maritime, oil and gas, right, all of these uses that have never had legitimate connectivity. Were you excited to issue equity where they did? Of course not, right? What you really want is you want to issue equity at an enormous price, an enormous multiple, and buy something that's trading at a really low multiple, and then get all the synergies from it. That's the holy grail. They're not going to get that here, but the deal makes an enormous amount of industrial logic, and we don't think there's a lot of dilution relative to the opportunity. Eugene, any other thoughts on the equity stuff?
No, I think from on the RigNet side, they've been talking to them for a long time, and in the end, it it was up to KKR, and seemingly that since KKR is ruling, that indicates that they probably wanted equity and didn't want to check, because if you look at their own proxy, people approached them in cash offers and they said no to those. So you can just do the math, right? I mean, I think it's pretty evident that this deal was going to be an equity deal, and it's unfortunate that Viasat was hated, as it's often been hated for off and on for the past 5 years, and it was a low point. And I agree with you. The optics are pretty bad. Issuing equity at what in hindsight was the bottom, and the COVID 20s looks terrible as well. I can't even defend. Mark Ninkberg is a great cultural leader, and I personally put him up there in terms of tech visionaries for his specific vertical. But I can't say that he cares per se what you or I think about the short-term stock price, because he doesn't manage this business like that. He never talks about stock prices and all the town halls that I was ever a witness to myself. He manages a business for 10 years, and that's how he thinks and acts. So it's a problem in our world, because we think of things maybe in 3-year terms, right? And so that the people who are like, oh, this has been a terrible investment. All right, well, in June or June of 2019, it was a great investment.
Yep.
So I don't know. Has anything changed since then? Starlink, I guess, is now operational, so that's probably the biggest change, I would say. But other than that, nothing, right? I don't see a competitive dynamic changing on the in-flight Wi-Fi. I only see them continuing to win more and more tails. So anyway, I again, all fair points, and as I've said, people who dislike the stock have very specific reasons, and I can reason them away in my mind, right? But I think those are fair points, and certainly I think similar to when Carousel wrote their short, we're in this air gap period between system launches, and I believe that specifically once the European one is up, that a lot of these conversations about bad returns and no cash flows and this and that, and the questions about growth potentials and all that other stuff that I think people have always piled on in these air gaps specifically, those will be cleared away for the uplift that we see.
Let me just obviously look. There's lots of different segments, and they're competing for in-flight is a much different competitive landscape and technical capabilities and everything. The rural broadband, and that's different than government. But let me just zoom out a second. Again, I've invested in cable, and for a long time, one of the bear cases for cable was, hey, 5G wireless broadband is coming, and it's gonna beat cable. And all the cable execs, and I believe this, this is why I have a position in cable, all of them said, hey, look, 5G wireless, great. Yes, it might serve some rural homes, it might serve, but if you really wanted to compete with cable, you're basically an overbuilder, right? Because you're going to have to build that within 200 yards of someone's home, get that signal going, give them equipment and stuff. Like, it looks very much like an overbuilder. And the real thing is, what wins with home broadband and what wins with the internet is having that pipe, that cable or fiber pipe, as close to the consumer as possible. That's the most important thing. So if I zoom out and I look at Viasat, which is GEO, which is hundreds of miles in the air, you can correct me if I'm wrong, versus LEO, which is what SpaceX is doing, which is a lot closer. I think it's 65 miles into the atmosphere. I can't remember off the top of my head. You can correct me if I'm wrong. But when I just look at that in general, I say, overall, LEO is closer to the consumer. Maybe for rural broadband, maybe we're talking government, whatever we're talking about. It's closer to the consumer. Closer to the consumer generally means lower latency. It generally means better speeds, all that type of stuff. So why is Viasat's GEO option the right option overall? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think those are all correct statements, except for LEO being lower doesn't mean faster speeds. speeds are independent of the plane of which you orbit the Earth. It means certainly less lag, just the actual physical distance between the end connectivity point and the satellite is lower. So I mean, I guess if you're a gamer and you use Twitch a lot, or a live streamer, that will matter to you. If you're
a video podcaster, you got to have that latency tight.
Correct.
So I can interview two people from Cove Street at the same time.
So all those video podcasters in the middle of North Dakota are, just SOL right now in terms of Viasat and Hughes. So they're going to have to switch over to Elon. But I don't think that there are that many people who care enough so that they're going to pay $500 for equipment and then $100 a month for service, right? And in the end, what does someone care about? They care about, again, I want to watch Netflix and Hulu and whatever, and I want to go on YouTube and waste 3 hours of my life, and I want to browse the internet and go on whatever, Reddit and the other 55 things that people do, order food or go on Amazon. None of those things are prevented right now by that system.
What you're describing is on the rural broadband side, which I think there's value, but as you said, it's become less important over time. But like, if I'm the government and Viasat's coming and pitching to me, why is my answer to them not, hey, SpaceX has this LEO system, which is lower latency, which is huge for government, right? Because milliseconds can make all the difference in the world in a battle or fight or whatever. So why is the government not saying 3 years from now, hey, Viasat, we're going to start dialing back because this huge SpaceX system's in the air, and Wall Street Journal has the Elon Musk and Amazon are battling to put internet in your backyard. Obviously, we're not talking rural, but there's SpaceX, Amazon, Jeff Bezos, it's Blue Origins are looking to put up. Why is the government not trying to shift more to LEO? Why is that not a risk in the medium term?
So the answer is they are, and I encourage everyone to read. Actually, of all places, the GAO came out with an audit of government satellite service purchasing in 2019, and they put a big 80-page paper out about it, and they talked about what's the appropriate use of, and I think it's somewhere around $4.5 billion that the U.S. between the DoD, State Department, and all the agencies spend on connectivity, just so you understand how big that pie is, besides the residential broadband side. And what they said is speaking to various stakeholders, ranging from the Air Force, Navy, the State Department, we think that the best solution going forward is a hybrid system of GEO and LEO. And so I 100% agree with you that I think LEO, and I don't know if it's, I think SpaceX has a higher, is going to have a much higher hill to climb there, because the way that they've designed their satellites doesn't actually embed very much a lot of jam resistant or encryption protected connectivity elements within it. And plus they're not, in order for them to get to the price points that he's talking about, they're cheap, meaning that they're not high rel, which is high reliability componentry. So they will get some piece, right? Some maybe lower priority communication systems that the military will put through their networks. I actually think that the DoD will have a hybrid of their own LEO system plus a commercial backend that's more palatable in terms of their encryption capabilities, and a geo backbone. And then the reason why there are certain applications that, like you said, that you would want to have low latency, and there are other applications where it's just about connectivity in various regions. And Leo's problem is that without, and if you want now you got me, you're gonna start getting me to dork out on this, but if you do not have landing gateways in various parts of the world, then you're not going to have a gateway in China or Russia or Mongolia or Iran or any of the countries that the DoD cares about. So how do you get that information back? the answer is intersatellite lasers for LEO. Unfortunately for Elon and SpaceX and everyone else, that still is it's a dream. Now, what do I mean by that? You can do it, but you can't do it at the price point that he wants.
Yeah.
And so, sure, again, like I always check, my desire to say, oh, that's never going to happen, because I was, clearly wrong, right? People funded him, and it's going to happen. But these first 1,400 or whatever he's at now satellites don't have ISL, and he, in his initial launch requests and petitions to the FCC, had those, and they had to take them out because they couldn't get the lasers correct. And I know he tweeted out, it's coming. Okay, well, let's see. I have also checked in a bunch of specialized laser people who that's the only thing that they do, and they don't think that that he can do it at the price point. I'm not saying functionality, that there's two different things, functionality and price, right? So you can have the functionality, but if he wants to have a system that doesn't cost him 18 billion as opposed to 9 billion, then he needs to be correct on the actual cost side. And as far as I can tell, I haven't found anyone that can hit those numbers, and they're coming from a very specialized perspective. So maybe he can do it. Let's see. But anyway, going back to my point, like what you're talking about is a 5 to 7 year problem. Maybe if they can figure out how to do inter satellite lasers and actually put birds up that can communicate and backhaul information to the necessary government elements. And if you're flying the reconnaissance drone in the middle of Iran looking for a nuke base, like that's great, but you have to have a way to get the info back. Anyway, long story short, there will be a need for GEO in many locations. That LEO is irrelevant, and most of the locations that the government cares about, LEO will be irrelevant.
I think the coolest thing you said in that entire thing was the fact that you have specialized laser guys that you talk to. I mean, it's pretty cool to have a specialized laser guys. But
can I jump in real quick?
Yeah, I was actually going to
just to jump in on that a little bit. So I think we as a firm do not want to underestimate any of the competition, especially Starlink and SpaceX. But they're just realities that are that everyone has to take into consideration. One is that SpaceX doesn't have, well, SpaceX, but Starlink does not have really a government military business right now. We spoke to a former SpaceX engineer who said that Elon had to be convinced almost after the fact that encryption and jam resistance were an important part, because he wasn't really thinking about it from a military perspective. Now, of course, they can solve any technological problem. But my point is that Viasat has a multi-decade relationship with the government and the military. They're going to have a half a decade to a full decade lead in terms of providing connectivity to and equipment to the military. And then if to layer on top of that, the fact that, sorry, I lost it.
That's okay.
Where was I going with that?
This conversation does remind me again, and not to bring everything back to cable, but Google Fiber everyone was terrified of Google Fiber for the longest time. That's the company that was, Google is a behemoth. They've got unlimited pocketbooks. They could argue for Google Fiber that they were building out, and they didn't even need it to be economic, because they could make the vague argument, hey, owning the customer, having them do 4 more searches a month or something is going to be great for our business. They had all these arguments, but in the long run, they ran into physics, and they ran into the issues of physics. Going and laying this fiber and doing home-by-home builds is really expensive. And even for a company with Google's pocketbooks, the physics and the economics of it, eventually it came back to haunt them, and they looked at it and said, we can't do this. And with LEO, I think there's advantages, but as you guys are saying, eventually they're going to run into, there's physics and economic problem that even SpaceX at $100 billion can't overcome.
Sorry, I remember what I was going to say.
Go ahead.
Viasat's already making LEOs, which we haven't said. Viasat is already making LEOs for the military, right? Right, Eugene? This is already happening, right? So
they have a trial that they've, I think, 2 that they've built for. Was it the Air Force? I think it was the Air Force to try Again, going back to the military will never go to 100% anything, right?
Yeah.
Redundancy is the number one thing for them. They still have a WGS system in the satellite space that was built and designed in 1986 that they're operating and spending billions of dollars on. Why? Because they know that in a nuclear blast, that thing will still be, transmitting. So, again, I love the military side. I honestly think that people just don't get it. It's much harder to do diligence on that side as well, because what are you going to do? Are you going to call up an Air Force general and ask them about the future programs that they're on? Yeah, right. So anyway, I think that's really where people miss what the Viasat is, and and I get it, right? That all the like you said, the Wall Street Journal puts out these pieces and Gadget and whoever, right? I mean, it's cool, right, to write about SpaceX, and as it should be. But
not only is it cool, but people want to read it, right? Like Elon Musk's tweets are some of the most popular, engaging tweets out there. People want to read. It's a sexy, exciting story. People don't want to read Viasat's got a 4-year-old satellite that covers a lot of things and delivers data pretty cheaply. They want to hear 500 satellites flying around in space and covering everything really quickly. Look, I wouldn't be cognizant of time. It's been over an hour. Viasat's it's an interesting story. It's a complicated story. Obviously, you guys have done a lot of work on it. I want to make sure with both of you, and Ben, why don't we start with you? Is there anything that you wish we had covered, or any piece that you think a lot of people miss when they think of Viasat that you think they should be aware of? We'll start with Ben, and then Eugene, we'll flip it over to you after this, so we can make sure everybody's getting the overall overview of this.
Yeah, there's not one thing. I actually have a list of bullet points that I'd like to go through, and it'll be
a couple,
pretty quick. The prior FCC and regulators basically allowed Starlink and others to put up LEOs and basically cover the sky with very, very limited, from what we can see, regulation or desire to study whether it makes sense, or worry about space debris or the environmental impact. And so I think everyone just assumes that he's going to get, this is Elon, whatever, 8,000 to 12,000 satellites. I will just say that there's a lot of pushback, and a lot of pressure on the Biden administration to reconsider just like unfettered access to the sky, whether it's
other governments have issues with that. I know there's been discussion, so I'm leading you somewhere, but like if I'm Russia, EU, whatever, I'm not going to be super happy that the US is just saying, hey, Elon, put 10,000 satellites up there. Just kind of leading.
Correct. And so if the base case of every investor who's looking at this space is that there will be no regulation, we see regulation at all of, and we think there's a legitimate reason for it as well, because, and Eugene could talk about it, but there's something called the Kessler syndrome, where the number, especially with as many objects are going to be in low orbit, it's not like you add one more satellite and there's a linear increase in the risk of a space collision. It's actually exponential. And so there is an enormous amount of risk here that where whatever you put X number of satellites up there, that you hit a tipping point, then the space junk problem already exists, is that, and then all of a sudden you hit, there's a bunch of debris that's created as a result of a collision. It gets close to the International Space Station. All of these things have already happened, right? And if you're going to be putting tens of thousands of more satellites up there without understanding that risk and appreciating that risk, we just think that the regulators could look at this more closely. And if it does, I think that benefits them, the incumbents and Viasat, because they have a geo, right? They're going to put up 3 more satellites versus, Musk launches 60 at a time. Another thing about Viasat is people are always, and this is people think very linearly, and they're like, well, what's going to make this grow? And they look for a silver bullet. There is no silver bullet here. The answer is everything, right? So maybe rural broadband is not what we thought it was going to be, but community Wi-Fi wasn't even on our radar really a few years ago until they started off in Mexico. IFC, in-flight Wi-Fi, we didn't really talk about it, but the fact is, when the 2 Viasat 3 constellations are up in EMEA and APAC, we're going to have transatlantic and trans-Pacific connectivity that do not exist today. So you're going to be able to hop on a plane from Tokyo to LA, or LA to Munich, and you're going to have connectivity through a large portion of that, and it's going to be fast. And it's going to completely change transatlantic, trans-Pacific flying because you're going to have an internet connection. So the answer is not one thing; it's everything. And so one of the things that Eugene pointed out is like this is a really hard stop for people to evaluate because they're like, well, what is the growth? Well, it's everything. It's military plus in-flight Wi-Fi, community Wi-Fi, and rural broadband. I think the other thing, Viasat's not to the degree that SpaceX is, where they can launch their own satellites with their launch vehicles, but Viasat is heavily vertically integrated, right? And they've become more vertically integrated, and that means they're going to be more profitable. As we talked about, there's this, I look at the being involved in the hardware for the Link 16 and base stations. That's a form of vertical integration because you're providing the hardware and then you can provide the connectivity. I just don't think a lot of people appreciate the synergies between those two things. And then another thing that people don't talk about is that, look, there's a lot of hype around space, right? Kathy Wood's gonna, launch a space ETF, and there's all these SPACs that are merging with space companies. Now, Viasat has hardware that they can sell to all of these companies, ground stations and base stations, and so they can benefit from the commercial network segment from just that activity. So there's another thing that really people don't talk about and maybe underappreciating. I think. Eugene put this out there, but I think people are thinking too binary, LEO or GEO. Which one? The answer is both. And whether that's rural broadband, whether that's military, and we talked about this before, but at home, as you're getting your broadband, is there one provider? No, I mean, unless you're in a rural place where there's almost no fiber, right? You have 2 or 3 different options. Right? This is not a winner take all market. If anything, like people are so used to looking at software companies, this is one of the least, satellite connectivity is one of the least scalable things you can possibly imagine. As opposed to network effects, they're actually, dyssynergies and negative effects, the more users that go on. Right. So the more successful you are, the more users you get, the worse the experience is for the existing players. So that's the other thing to remember is that, this is not a winner take all, right? There's not going to be one satellite player out there serving everybody. Just like in home broadband, there's going to be multiple players. There's going to be, they're going to have different sales forces, and the competitive advantage is how cheaply you can provide it, I think. And then, I think, again, another binary way of thinking is that everyone thinks that like Starlink's success means that Viasat cannot be successful, and we just don't agree with that. If Starlink is successful and it expands the total addressable market for everybody, Viasat, as Eugene pointed out so eloquently, is going to get a share of that. And they're kind of a play on the same thing, which is that you have exploding bandwidth demands, which we haven't really dove into. But I think I read that 70 to 80% of usage right now is video in the US for connectivity. And if you look at the amount of growth that we've seen, I mean, some of it's COVID induced as people are staying at home, but if you look at the consumption as all of the streaming services have absolutely proliferated, it's enormous, right? So that gets to the TAM, it gets to the capacity question you asked. Like there is demand for that capacity, right? And so I don't think Starlink and Viasat are like these binary things where you can only own one. You can own both, assuming Elon finds a way for other people to invest in it. But in any case, like it's not like one is six. It's not a zero-sum game. Is probably the best way to describe it. I think those are my top ones. So those the things that we just hear over and over again that we kind of tear our hair out. And look, the company has not done an amazing job at PR or IR to be out there arguing these points. And Musk, with his unbelievable ability to hype things, has won the PR battle. But you'll notice that Viasat has started to get the message, and they are out there a lot more. I think they've been in this waiting game, and until they have Viasat 3 up, until you have the Americas one up, until you start putting the EMEA one up, people are going to doubt it. But it's when you start seeing the results, you're seeing the subscribers, you're seeing the free cash flow, that's when it's going to be, okay, this is what Mark said it was going to be. And I think there's going to be a sentiment shift regarding like, all of the shorts you mentioned, and all of the the naysayers who are just sure that Starlink or Kuiper or Telesat are going to destroy what the existing Viasat is.
Eugene, same thing. Anything you wish we had discussed, or anything you kind of just wanted to hit on a little harder before we maybe wrap this thing up?
Yeah, that's I think Ben had a pretty good summary. I mean, the only thing I would add is no one ever talks about the commercial network side. I know Ben kind of touched on it, but the fact that they can provide third-party hardware to remote sensing stations and folks that are in other avenues of satellite tech delivery, aka like taking pictures of the Earth, and how do you get that information back down? And they can provide a lot of the hardware necessary to enable some of the more very cool stuff that's coming down the pipe, and a lot of the specs that are being raised are kind of concentrated on a lot of the things that will actually help with order backlogs in the commercial network system. So that's kind of my only thing, but I know Ben already kind of touched on literally everything else, so I'll end it there.
I have one more for us. ESG, Viasat, ultimate ESG company. How so? The idea that we were going to that Mark Zuckerberg and who else was it? And Google were going to connect through Loon. We're going to connect all these people who would never touch the internet in places like Mexico and Brazil and Africa and all the places that Viasat is already doing so, right? Like if you think that there's a societal global social benefit of people having internet connectivity in a way that they never have, Viasat has created a community Wi-Fi model that actually gives people connectivity. And so, from an ESG perspective, I think that's actually a pretty cool thing that they don't talk about. And other people have had all these goals of doing it and have failed at it. And somewhere under the radar, Viasat's already doing it.
Look, I love that you're out here pitching for ESG. I know Viasat and Loral, I've had people say, hey, I'd like to come on the podcast and talk Viasat or Loral, or when they heard you were coming on, they emailed and they're like, look, the most important thing at this point is I need them to pitch this as a space play and get it into Cathie Wood's space ETF. That's what's really going to drive the flows in the near term. So I did think when you said you guys want to talk about it, I thought, oh, maybe they want me to tag Cathie Wood when I post this on Twitter and see if we can get this put in. Let me wrap this up with one thing, just something I'm trying to do with all my things. So, I'm looking at your March 2020 slides, best idea Viasat, price 42, target within 3 years, 125 to 160. As we mentioned, there's been a little equity issuance. The shares are at 52, so it's actually done pretty well since then. But, if I'm thinking 3, 5, 7 years out, what's kind of not the Super Bowl case, not the, what's kind of y'all's most reasonable base case for what we're playing for here? They both thought and looked at each other.
Dr. Evil.
Do we want to say 200? Do we want to say 100?
Look, I don't know. You said reasonable. Okay, so not like I guess best case. I think reasonable is 105 to 115. Once they start kind of showing, showing the show me crowd actual revenue coming from the satellites and an expanding of the cash flow generation from their network, from when the not only the North America one but the EMEA one comes up, and you'll start seeing the cash flow from operations start to inflect upwards again and approach not only a break even on the capex but actually provide free cash flow. And I think that'll be one of the big drivers of the stock. It'll take it into the hundreds even after the dilution. Now cuckoo values,
Cuckoo value was the Intelsat. If they had been allowed to monetize C-band, that stock would have been it might have been 200 per share these days. When you said I'm just going to use 100, and I think that's approaching around a $10 billion EV if I'm doing the math in my head correctly. So would I be right in saying you think this company, 5 years out, 300 to 400 million annually in free cash flow is kind of right? Or how are you kind of just thinking about the long-term steady state economics of this once Viasat 3's up, Viasat, all that?
Okay, well, and now you're getting to like what
we are running really long, so if
that's cool. Again, models are almost entirely worthless, I think, farther than like 1 week out. But if you're asking, you are, after the full constellation is up, the maintenance capex, and they'll never really be at maintenance because Mark's already talking about the fourth generation, which is he put out an 8 terabit number per satellite, which is insane to think about. But anyway, the maintenance numbers be somewhere between $400 and $600 million of capital expenditures, right? And like I usually, I tell people like I hate EBITDA in this case because they truly have a capital charge. Yeah, real. Exactly. It's not. This isn't like EBITDA is a proxy. No, it's not. It's they have a real capital charge. But the cash flow from operations number should start approaching somewhere around like 1.3 to 1.5 billion. So you can kind of do the math.
You're talking about this is after tax, CFO less capex. You're talking about $1 billion annually, and the market cap is, what is it? I'm just pulling up blue. Current market cap's 3.5 billion, EV's 5 billion. So, if you're right and you do that, actually you said 100, but if you're right, you're probably playing for a lot more than 100 on that.
Yeah, I don't even want to say it because again, I've already it really looks stupid for most people. Like, oh, this guy's putting out a 125 to 160, and this thing is like $30. What are you, moron? But honestly, this is. I think again, I don't look at the sales side stuff too, but I think that cone of variability as you put it out, like 42 to whatever the top one was, that's indicative of a stock that you can make outsized returns on because the general kind of dispersion of expectation is so immense that I don't believe that this could be properly priced in the market.
And look, it sounds stupid when you say it's at 40 and I think it can be worth, I'm just going to pull a number 400. But, I think one of the biggest mistakes I made, and I'm trying to get better, is I buy a stock at 5 and I put in my notes, hey, I think this could happen. And I think if it does happen, this is not a $5 stock, it's a $50 stock. And then it drifts up to 11. I'm like, oh, let me trim a lot here. And I'm not adjusting for, the case where it was really bullish that I thought could happen, no one else thought could happen, it's increasingly more likely. So I need to hold this because this home run scenario, not only is it on the table, it's like in play and increasingly the odds are for it. Ben, I'll wrap it up with you. Any last thoughts or anything we haven't hit you wanted to mention briefly?
No, I mean, I think Eugene has done a really nice job of summarizing why this is one of our largest positions. We're very close to it. And to your point, maybe too close to sometimes. And so that's why we're always interested in engaging with people and understanding, what they think is wrong with this thesis, where they think we're missing something, where we might be overstating things. But I think I just want to finish with this. The idea is that it's not that hard to understand what they do. Right. This isn't some kind of esoteric biotech where there's this, you have to understand the chemistry and the science. It has a technology aspect to it, but it's not too hard to understand. Like, they're providing broadband and hardware to people.
It's not an esoteric biotech. It's only rocket science.
It's only rocket science. Easy stuff for Eugene, but for the rest of us. But my point is, like, there's just a lot of nuances here, and there's a lot of work to do. And the typical sell side analyst, not that we pay attention to, but the sell side analyst, like the typical person who covers a telecom stock, doesn't cover defense. Right. And so, they have a lot of trouble, I think, understanding it. So there's a lot of misunderstandings and misperceptions. A lot can go right and a lot can go wrong. If you go through our recent presentation on this, we list any number of risk factors. So we want to make sure that you understand, like, we have a pretty balanced view of this. It's just, the fact is, if they do what they can say they can do on a cost per bit basis, and they get those satellites up and the TAM continues to grow, it's almost going to be, I hate the word inevitability, but it's really just going to be filling up satellites as opposed to all of this, any other heavy lifting. And if they can do that with a commercial organization they have, and continue to build a military business, this is going to be a forever stock for us. That's why we've been such good. I think we've been evangelists for it for that reason, because we see something that has been latent. It's been hidden by COVID. It's been hidden by delays in satellite launches. It's been, hidden in this like delay between Viasat 2 and the Viasat 3 constellation. And this is kind of the inflection point. And that's why we think it's interesting for people to start working now, because it's going to take you a little time to get up on it. Please feel free to reach out to us. Go to our website, covestreetcapital.com. You can see other podcasts we've done on this topic. We've also, there's a number of PowerPoint presentations we've done. But if you have questions or comments, we'd love to hear from you. And anybody who has the short case, we look forward to engaging with you.
Well, look, I'll be sure to include a link to the website in the show notes, so anybody who's listening can see it there. I have the presentation. I think I can link to it in the show notes. If not, we'll figure it out. But Eugene, Ben, thank you guys so much for coming on. The work's been great. Really interesting name, great conversation. And looking forward to having you guys again in the future, whether it's when Viasat 3 launches or when we're talking about the next one. But thanks again, guys.
Thanks a lot, Andrew.